Well, thank you everyone for coming to this and having an interest in the work of the Foreign Mission Committee of our denomination. As you may know, Reverend Marcus and I went on a trip just a couple weeks ago to Mexico, and so have a few slides here, lots of pictures and a few videos even of our trip, and just thought while I'm here, it'd be good to inform you of things that we did and the purpose for our going and so on, and pray that it can be of encouragement to you as well. So I'm just going to take a seat here and we'll begin. So it was a Foreign Mission Committee investigatory trip to Axtla de Terrazas. And I'm not good with Spanish, so I'll probably mispronounce many things, especially if you know Spanish, you'll hear some pretty glaring errors, I'm sure. But Reverend Marcus knows it very well, I do not. I do have a laser pointer too, so can point out some things every once in a while. We went to Axtla. That's not a very well-known town in Mexico. I don't think I've ever encountered anyone here that's heard of it before. But you will see there's Mexico City. So Axtla's the red arrow. So just a few hours north of Mexico City, and you're about 3 hours from the Gulf of Mexico. I'm going to be talking about the city of Tampico. That's where we flew into. Tampico would be just about right there, not very far from the Gulf of Mexico at all. We went as a delegation on behalf of the Foreign Mission Committee. The Foreign Mission Committee is centered in Iowa, and if you're a minister in that Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota tri-state area, then you're kind of automatically on the FMC, and a group of elders too. So the FMC is a committee that reports to Synod each year, and we're always looking for open doors in terms of mission work, or at least places where we can go. And that was our purpose, to go down to Axtla de Terrazas and to investigate a contact that we came into communication down there with. And that contact, his name is Pastor Sergio Vasquez, and his local congregation in Axtla, and the name of that local congregation is Emmanuel. So Pastor Sergio and his local congregation, Emmanuel, both in Axtla. But then Pastor Sergio and his congregation also have a mission work in nearby Ahuacatlan. You'll see a map later, but Ahuacatlan is just a little down south and to the west. So you have Axtla, the congregation, and Pastor Sergio, and this mission work. And we went to investigate all those things. So I have a few stories for you because I guess don't travel with me at all because I had trouble getting here too. But I flew out of Sioux Falls to Chicago, O'Hare. Met up with Reverend Marcus. He was the other one that went on this delegation. We flew together from O'Hare to Houston, and the intended itinerary was to go from O'Hare to Houston to Tampico, Mexico, and that's where the pastor would pick us up and bring us to Axtla. But the Lord had different plans, and we went from O'Hare to Houston without any incident. When we arrived in Houston, of all places, there were freezing conditions. I think the cold temperatures that we are all experiencing dipped even as far down as Texas. And we were able to land, but we weren't able to get our connecting flight to Tampico because United wasn't flying their airplanes because of the conditions. So Reverend Marcus and I came into Houston Airport, and we probably came to the boat here, middle of the line, and we asked someone, "Is this the line for United?" And they said, "Yes, it is." So that was quite a discouraging thing. So we came all the way back here, and you can see this line just extends all the way down there, and then it wraps for a while over there. And this was a line for United customer service to get your flight redirected. So this is nighttime already. We're not even hoping to get to Tampico yet on this day, Monday. So we finally, after 3 hours, got to the United help desk, and we talked to a woman, and she got us redirected to go the next day, Tuesday, from Houston to Mexico City, and from Mexico City to Tampico. So we were very thankful for that. We called Uber, and we were able to find a motel. There was not much available, and the motel we stayed at was rather suspect. And our Uber driver who picked us up to bring us to the airport again Tuesday morning said, I could tell that you had to stay somewhere because this really isn't a good motel or area. So we came back to the airport here, and we were able to fly then Tuesday morning to Mexico City. No incidents, on time. When we arrived in Mexico City, we discovered that our luggage had been lost, probably due to the weather conditions in Houston and all the rigmarole that happened there. So I don't know about Reverend Marcus, but at this point, I was thinking a few times in all of these providences is what is the Lord showing us here? Should we even go on this trip? You think that something like this is honoring to the Lord? But it's just barricade after barricade, it seemed like. But when we were in Mexico City, waiting in line to talk with a United representative about our lost luggage, we came to realize, at least in part, why it was the Lord's plan that all these things needed to happen. There was a Muslim in that line who asked Reverend Marcus and me many, many questions. And it was a marvelous opportunity to witness to this man of the Reformed faith, talk to him of the Scriptures, and we both looked at each other later and we said, now we know, at least in part, why all these delays and the lost luggage and so on. So I think it's a good reminder. We don't always know why God brings certain things into our life, but sometimes He lifts the veil a little bit. So you might wonder, the luggage is lost. When did you get your luggage back? This is Tuesday when we land in Mexico City and they tell us we can't find your luggage. We got our luggage on Friday. So I had church pants on and church shoes. And so you just sleep in those and walk around in those. And hopefully they invite you back again after that. But I think FedEx or something delivered our clothes to a nearby town to Axtla, and the pastor graciously brought us there to pick it up. So we fly Tuesday from Mexico City to Tampico, and Pastor Sergio and a young man from the mission were there to pick us up, and that was very refreshing for us. Glad to see them. We had only communicated with them online over video and emails. So it was wonderful to meet them for the first time face to face. They picked us up from the airport, Pastor Sergio did. It's a 3-hour drive for him to get from Axtla to Tampico. and he has a little Jetta, and more on that in a little bit. But he picked us up from the airport, and it wasn't even 15 minutes into our drive in Tampico that Pastor Sergio got in a crash with another man. Not a serious crash, it was a fender bender, but the two spoke in Spanish and they negotiated it and figured it out, and I think it was more Pastor Sergio's fault, but the other guy let him go. Pastor Sergio told us later, he said, had it been only you two in the car, you could have been in serious trouble. He suspected that that man even could have been a part of the mafia. And he said, when Mexicans see Americans, they see dollar signs. And you could have been in grave trouble. So we're thankful for the Lord's protection there. After that incident, we came to a bank in Mexico, in Tampico. Reverend Marcus wanted to exchange some American money for pesos. Another interesting experience is that while we're at this bank, Reverend Marcus and I are sitting in these chairs, and over here, we see another man that we didn't know approach him, Pastor Sergio. I asked Reverend Marcus, I said, do you know him? He said, I've never seen him before. Pastor Sergio told us later that this man was a guy he didn't know either, and the guy approached Pastor Sergio and said, you don't have to go through the bank. He said, I can give you a much better exchange rate than they can. And Pastor Sergio didn't bite on that, and a bank employee even came up and said, is everything okay here? But that's just another interesting thing. They see dollar signs when they see Americans, and you just look over your shoulder even when you go out of the bank back to the car. So I'm not trying to give the impression that this is just a war zone here, but there are certain things you have to look out for, apparently. Here's Pastor Sergio's little Jetta. We drove from Tampico after the bank and so on. And it was a 3-hour trip, as I said, back to Axtla where we needed to be. And I have white knuckle experience because that's what it was. Pastor Sergio drives at high rates of speed, like Jehu in the Bible. And he tailgating people, at least according to our American standards, he's 5 feet behind people going fast. And that's accepted down in Mexico, I guess. And he's crossing the double yellow line, passing other trucks and vehicles. And there were times where a semi-truck was barreling in the incoming lane, and we probably didn't have more than 100 yards before that truck was upon us. And I'm just grabbing onto the seat for dear life. And that was quite an experience, but I guess that's pretty common down there. So, relatively speaking, we arrived safely in Axtla. This is a video, and I'll play in a minute. You are inside the house of the woman who hosted us for the week. Her name is Sister Ines. Very gracious host, godly woman. Treated Reverend Marcus and myself very well and hospitably. Sister Ines lives in Axtla, and you have to picture this. I'll show it to you in a little bit. But this is a city, bustling city, lots of shops, and she's right in the middle of all that. But this is her yard. So you're looking out a window or slats into her yard. You could see, you know, they don't have American yards like we do, nice grass, so on. There are roosters out here and a dog. And I want to give you a little taste, although this doesn't do justice to it, to what we woke up to in the morning and sometimes a few hours before that. So now you have to magnify that by about 10. And it's just constant animal noise. And it's happening, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, dogs yelping at everything that passes him in the street. Just want to point out a few just different interesting features of where we were at. Lots of fruit trees. Very tropical region. Oranges, lemons, you name it. And we were able to drink a lot of fresh juice. This is a home of a person that is a part of Emmanuel. Right there is a cage with a parrot in it, and it, of course, speaks Spanish, not English words. This just gives you a little taste. It's not too much, but of walking down a street in Axtla. A lot of pedestrians, older cars, but quite densely populated. As far as the church itself is concerned, kids, can you see something on top of the roof? 2 dogs. When we first arrived at the church, we were greeted by dogs on the roof of the church just barking at us. Pastor Sergio and his wife and his 2 teenage daughters live, I would say, over here, so not right above the church, but just a little bit to the side. The church is sort of built on a hill. And so the parsonage is up there, and the dogs kind of roam free. So you see, here's Emmanuel, the congregation that we came to visit. Pastor Sergio is the pastor of it. The building itself that you see here has been around for 40-something years. Pastor Sergio, of course, you'll see pictures of him. He has not been pastor of it the whole time. The church, in its earlier years, was historically Baptist. But since Pastor Sergio now kind of took over, and he's been a part of the church for the last number of years, he sought to change it in a more reformed direction. He's always endeavoring to go in that direction. In the middle is Pastor Sergio, and the 2 guys in pink are the 2 deacons in the church, so I'll treat those in order. First of all, Pastor Sergio there in the middle. You could see fairly young. I think he's mid-40s or so. Just wanted to give you a little bit of history about this man. For his own theological training, he attended a Baptist seminary in Mexico. And after graduating from that seminary, he preached in Axtla. And some of these details are not so clear, but I assume it's at this church, Emmanuel. He also, in addition to laboring in Emmanuel, he taught at a Baptist seminary. Our understanding is that this is a volunteer basis sort of thing. But he taught at a Baptist seminary. And in the course of his teaching, he was being asked questions by students about predestination and calling. As he fielded these questions from students, he more and more, I guess you could say, looked at the instruction he had received and found it to be wanting. He saw what the scriptures taught about predestination and efficacious calling, and came to see more and more the Reformed truth. And he began teaching that then to his students. The seminary authorities caught wind of this and told him, Sergio, you're not allowed to teach here anymore if you're going to be teaching those things. After he is more or less kicked out of the seminary, he's also ostracized by other pastors in his convention. You know, in the Baptist Church in the United States, you have the Southern Baptist Convention, roughly equivalent to a denomination. Well, the convention of which he was a part in Mexico, the Armenian pastors in that said, we don't want anything to do with you if you're going to be teaching these things. So it's just a reminder of what this man has to face because he teaches the pure gospel of grace. In the course of his learning the Reformed faith, he came across the Covenant Protestant Reformed Church website. That's Reverend Stewart in Northern Ireland. On that website are, you should look it up sometime, a lot of Spanish resources. Pastor Sergio began reading that literature. He came to talk with Reverend Stewart or to communicate with him some way. Reverend Stewart then put Pastor Sergio in touch with First Protestant Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, because you might be familiar with the fact they've been sending delegations down to Mexico. So Reverend Stewart said, you go talk to them. Well, First Protestant Reformed Church then directed the FMC's attention to Pastor Sergio. See, First Church has its own work in Mexico, but Pastor Sergio is distinct from that. And so First Church said, you know what, FMC? Why don't you look into this one? So we did. Started communicating with Pastor Sergio. A man by the name of Donner Bartolone helped us immensely in that process. He knows Spanish and English. And so we set up a trip, and that's where we are today, that we're able to go down there. I wanted to say just a couple things about Pastor Sergio himself, besides his history. Very fun, loving, jovial even personality. And I couldn't help but observe how helpful that was for Pastor Sergio. He has such a good rapport with his congregation. You could just see it on their faces. He's just a very fun, loving, Christian, brotherly man, and has a tireless zeal for the ministry, going into people's. He brought us to a lot of people's homes. Drives many miles in his little Jetta to go here and there, preaches on Sunday, very high energy by the grace of God. The two deacons here, the church does not have any elders. Pastor Sergio expressed to us on a number of occasions the inadequacy of that. He knows they need elders, but he doesn't feel that the two men are quite yet qualified for the eldership, need to grow in knowledge, but those are good men. And Pastor Sergio testified to that. And the two men told us too, they want to learn the Reformed faith, and Lord willing, one day they can be elders, and they can have elders in the church. So what we've been talking about has been Axtla, the local congregation, the pastor, and the two deacons there. Distinct from that is a mission of Pastor Sergio and Emmanuel. And the mission is located here in Aguacatlan de Jesus. As you can see, it's about an hour drive, and you're going to the west and somewhat to the south. So about an hour away. When you get here, and you can even see it a bit on the map, you're getting into mountains, and you're traveling up into pretty high elevations in order to get to Aguacatlan. And you're going through clouds. It's a really beautiful drive. Just a little bit of history of this mission in Aguacatlan. It began 8 years ago, and how it began was Pastor Sergio is always looking for outreach opportunities outside of Axtla, and his method is to hand out gifts from Samaritan's Purse, and to accompany those gifts with bringing the gospel to people. Initially, the mission, when it was started 8 years ago, it was entrusted to one of the deacons that you saw in the previous picture. And it began, the mission did with 10 families, and they met in a house. A few months ago, a man by the name of John Cook, we're going to come to him in a moment, an American missionary, John Cook, the mission was entrusted to him. And so he kind of heads that up, and they now meet in this building, a rented building in Awaka Glen, and they're down to 3 or 4 families. So, you know, you would just face so many discouragements in the Church of Jesus Christ. We all know that, and they do too. Pastor Sergio said, of these 10 families, a lot of them left because they just don't have Reformed convictions. This is a picture inside that mission building, so not huge, but plenty adequate for their needs. Now I want to talk about John Cook a little bit. Right there. He graduated from a Baptist seminary in the States, and he was sent by 2 churches in South Carolina to do mission work in Mexico. My understanding is that both of the churches are basically Southern Baptist. One has a little more of a Reformed Baptist leaning, one is a little more Baptist. So these 2 congregations send John Cook, and they're the ones that finance him. So John Cook, his wife Candace, and their 3 young children, this is not an old family, coming to labor in Mexico. It sounded like it was sort of open-ended that these 2 churches sent him. So John Cook is looking for a place to labor. He's becoming discouraged because so much Arminianism is rooted in Mexican churches. But John Cook, in the providence of God, came into contact with Pastor Sergio and his church in Axla. And John Cook thought to himself, wow, here's a man that teaches the truth of God's word. They became associated one with another. So Pastor Sergio is very much involved in the mission, but he's mostly in Axla, while John Cook, somewhat involved in Axla, is mainly involved in Awaka Glen, and he preaches for them, makes all his sermons in Spanish. He's learning Spanish, so quite a bit of sacrifice there. Both John Cook and Pastor Sergio are committed to different outreach, and see where the Lord may open up more doors in their area. Here is a video of, I don't think this was Sunday, but Reverend Marcus gave a speech. I think I have that later, just a little clip of that. But this is an example of their worship, and it would be very similar to Sunday.
Señor, es mi pastor.
So, pretty different from our worship. I'll talk about worship a little later, but yeah, many of the same things that we believe, the words that they are singing. Reverend Marcus, just a note on what we did when we were there. Reverend Marcus and I each had 2 speeches that we delivered, and each of us had 1 sermon that we preached. The way we would do it is, for example, if I was giving a speech or preaching a sermon, I would be at that music stand, or if you're back in Axtla, I would be, at their podium or pulpit, and I would give it in English, a little paragraph, and then Reverend Marcus would be standing beside me, and he would give it in Spanish. And that brings me to tell you that Reverend Marcus knows Spanish. He was born in Mexico, I think grew up there for a while, and just a marvelous gift that God has given to him and to our churches, that he's able to communicate with these people. I don't know how Reverend Marcus wasn't able to go to bed each night without a migraine, because I'm asking 100 questions to these people. Reverend Marcus is translating them for me. He's listening to Pastor Sergio and telling me what he's saying. He's translating all these speeches and sermons. So very, very thankful for the way that the Lord used Reverend Marcus on this trip. The speeches that we gave related to the doctrine of the church, the use of gifts in the church, and to missions. And this is just a little sample of Reverend Marcus talking in Spanish.
Amén. Voy a leer primero de 1 Corintios 12, versículo 12 a 20. Primero de Corintios 12, versículo 12 a 20. Porque así como
Very few people know English. If there are some Mexicans that went to the States to work for a few years, their English might be very broken, but very few know English. This John Cook, American missionary, when we came, he said, "You won't believe how long it's been since we've talked English to someone." This is outside the mission, so you're just stepping outside the door of that building, and it's so hard to get a picture of mountains through photos like this. But yeah, pretty tall mountains. I don't know if they would compare to Mount Baker and so on, but not that far behind by any means. So this is one big thing that we did when we were on the trip. We ate and ate and ate and ate and ate. And people told us, you won't regret eating a lot of their food. But we are told, you form a real connection with the people even through eating their food. So that was an important part of the trip, actually. And I'm just not used to eating this much every day, but everywhere you go, they've got a big meal for you. Pastor Sergio brought us, I think, every day to people's houses that go to Emmanuel. This would be an example of a woman whose house we came to and her family. And I believe this was breakfast. So she's making breakfast. These are tortillas. I don't think you want to get your hand in that. So I guess these would be what you would call enchiladas. And, everything's homemade, the tortillas. And you're eating lots of tortillas down there. And then very common for them to be dipped in some sauce. And you've got a kind of enchilada. There's crumbled, delicious cheese. And you just put that over the sauce on the tortilla. That was a very common breakfast item. Because we're from the United States, this is, by the way, inside the kitchen dining room of Sister Ines where we stayed. Because we were in the United States, Sister Ines's sons, and I think this is a wife of him, said, we want to get you pizza. And fine, that sounds good. Call this the tasty but infamous pizza because Pastor Sergio spotted some unmelted cheese in the middle. And Reverend Marcus and I got fairly sick the next day. And we believe it was food poisoning, and it may have been salmonella from that uncooked cheese. So the pizza was delicious, but I spent quite a bit of time in bed the next day. Reverend Marcus did a little bit too. He had a speech the next day. He was a little better off than I was, and I just said I stay in bed for a while. So nothing too serious, but some stomach issues that came along with that. I want to point out, well, I think that's coming in a different slide. We'll talk about it. This is an example of another visit we made with an older man in the congregation. He owns a cafe in town, just a little cafe here. Went there to drink some coffee with him, talk with him. Went with Pastor Sergio. This is very common breakfast. You got a hint of that from what that lady was making, but pretty much everywhere we went, breakfast is around 10 o'clock, lunch is around 2, and supper is going to be 7, 8 o'clock. This is breakfast, so you get a cut of beef, get your enchiladas, and black beans. Very, very good breakfast. I want to point out that this is probably a pretty good representation of a home, of a family in the congregation. This is all open air, no windows, which is very common there because usually it's hot. 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. And so you need this for ventilation. These people don't have air conditioning. And so if you could get any open air. The problem was when we went there, that Arctic blast dipped so low. I don't know what it was here, but we were -20 in South Dakota, wind chills of -40. I think that dipped so low that it was 40s, 50s, and 60s here. And that's why you see everyone with coats on. That's not normal. So Sister Ines, not this much open, but slats for windows and has some ventilation at the top, and pretty chilly when we were there. This is breakfast in another family's home. Another example of a meal. There's Pastor Sergio with his usual smile. Here's a picture with some people. Here's something very interesting. So we're back in Axtla here. This is inside the church building of Emmanuel. I want you kids to listen up, especially some of you older ones in catechism. There's something called the Westminster Shorter Catechism. If you are a Presbyterian, that would be your confession. We have the Heidelberg Catechism, Belgic Confession, Canons of Dort. they have the Westminster Standards, and a part of those standards is the Shorter Catechism. Maybe I could just go ahead to this, and we'll get to this in a minute. The Catechism program is that children 10 years and younger in Emmanuel learn the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And if you're older than 10 years old, then you're with the other people in the congregation, and during worship services, you kind of memorize and recite one question and answer from the Westminster. So they did that on Sunday. They've got a screen up here, and they show question and answer, and the congregation and the one leading it kind of go back and forth. So they are steeped in a catechism. So that's their catechism program, but this donor Bartolone that I mentioned earlier that helped us get in contact with Pastor Sergio, because he knows English and Spanish, he's been helping 3 children of the congregation with this. If you can, he offers an opportunity for you to memorize the Westminster Shorter Catechism in English. You have to keep in mind, these kids don't learn English in school. They don't know English. But now they're learning a confession in a totally foreign language to them, and they're expected to pronunciate it perfectly. 2 teenagers, Pastor Sergio's daughters, and 1 8-year-old girl. That's the 8-year-old girl right there, and those are her parents. All 3 of them memorized roughly 1/3 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. If I could put that into context, it would probably be like memorizing the first 10 or 15 lessons of your catechism book, the answers to it, but doing it in Spanish. And so Reverend Marcus and I agreed, when our catechism students get tired, let's bring this to them, and we can encourage them a little bit to keep on memorizing their catechism. So that's what Reverend Marcus is doing. Donor Bartolone asked Reverend Marcus, when you men are there, can you examine these 3 girls? And so Reverend Marcus is kind of jotting down notes, if they get anything wrong. They didn't do it perfectly, but quite well, all 3 of them. Here is that little 8-year-old girl sitting on the bench. Reverend Marcus is listening to her. Try to pick up just about a minute or 30 seconds worth.
More gods than one?
There is but one only, the living and true God.
How many persons? How many persons are there in the Godhead?
There are 3 persons in the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one God in same substance, equal in power and glory.
Nice. What are the decrees of God?
The decrees of God are His eternal purpose, according to the consent of His will, whereby for His own glory He hath foreordained whatsoever come to pass.
If we had done nothing else on this trip, to hear a little child confessing in a language we can understand the truth of God, that was very moving, and I hope encouraging to you too. This is after the exam, so Pastor Sergio's 2 daughters, just very nice, godly young ladies. And there's the 8-year-old girl there. I think Reverend Marcus gave them a couple American dollars each and some I had some candy, and so we kind of pooled our resources. And these kids think the world of that sort of stuff. This was very common after either worship services I think after a worship service, but also after any service during the week where we'd give speeches, you come outside. So this is behind the church building. We are outside, and we would have time of coffee and refreshments. Sweet bread is very common there. This is store-bought, but yeah, it's good. And then some kind of cookie type things there. And we'd have fellowship over these baked goods and coffee. And this would be quite a few, probably not all, of the people in the congregation. That's Pastor Sergio's wife there. Saturday evening, we had, I think they call these side ribs. And you got some charcoal of sorts down there, and they put some onions in there, and they just slathered this meat. I forget with what it was. That was some of the best meat I think I've ever had. Really, really good. So just another example of food down there. This is inside Emmanuel in Axtla, and just want to talk a little bit. We talked about Pastor Sergio and so on, but want to address their worship. Their services consist of prayer and singing and offerings, recitation of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, but the main element of their services, like ours, is preaching, and they put a definite emphasis on that. And they even told us, they said, don't be worried about going long, because we're used to long here. Pastor Sergio, I think it's uncommon if he gets done preaching within an hour. So encouraging to hear that too. Their songbook is a mixture of psalms and hymns. Pastor Sergio emphasized to us that I went in there, he said, and I got rid of all the Arminian hymns. He doesn't want anything to do with those. And they use guitar for accompaniment. And this guy over here is sitting on it's like a rectangular box, and they use that, they tap on that a little bit, and that is a drum. As far as their preaching and doctrine, like I said, their preaching is central to the worship services. They are Reformed in doctrine. Will we agree with them on every single detail? Probably not. You know, the matter of infant baptism, some things on the end times or eschatology, but they're very open to discussing. Don't want to put up any walls. And he even told us, you know, for certain matters like infant baptism, he said, you men show us from the Scripture what you believe, and be patient with us, and we will look at the Scriptures. So that's just another very nice and encouraging thing there. The people do find some of the doctrines hard to understand, but I guess you could get that in any congregation in our churches too. But they are eager to learn, and they're very attentive. The Pastor Sergio has had people who have left when he started up in the church, and they call him a heretic because he's teaching the Reformed truth, and they weren't used to hearing that when they were younger. Here's just one other clip of worship. Now this is in Axtla, and I think this was on Sunday. Does anyone recognize that? It is well with my soul, but I don't think that's the words. So I found that they have some tunes that are the same as ours, but it's not the same words. And here I'm singing them in my head, and this is beautiful. And then to learn that's not what they were singing. But that's just a little sampling. Here's Reverend Marcus and I with Pastor Sergio, and just a few concluding thoughts before I end. Ask you to remember to pray for these saints and for the pastor and the deacons, and pray that if it is the Lord's will, that He might open a door for us here. Exactly what that would look like, I don't know. But that the Lord would give us, as Protestant Reformed churches, open doors in other areas too. And just want to say how thankful Reverend Marcus and I were for the opportunity to travel here and to enjoy the communion of the saints. And really, when I come on a classical appointment to Linden, or when I go on a trip to Mexico, I don't know you well, and I didn't know them well. But I told one of the ladies here through an app on my phone, which translated it to English, where you are with God's people, you are with your family. And that common faith, beautiful. So a richly profitable trip, and we're grateful for it. I don't know what the plan was. I can close in prayer if you're okay with that. But before we do that, don't want to prolong it unnecessarily, but does anyone have any questions about anything you saw or something I may not have addressed that you'd like to know? Good. Why don't we close in prayer? Our Father, which art in heaven, we thank Thee for that truth of the communion of the saints. And even when we have not met someone or a group, even one time before on this side of Jordan, yet we can celebrate our oneness in Jesus Christ, one faith, one hope, and one heritage. And so we're thankful for that, even as we have that represented here, but also in the trip to Mexico. We pray earnestly, Father, that if it be Thy will, that a door would be opened here in Axtla and Ahuacatlan, and that doors would be open in many other places of the world where we may labor and bring that glorious gospel of grace. Strengthen Pastor Sergio, the deacons, and the missionary John Cook, as well as the saints. Keep them strong in the faith, dedicated to Thy service, doing all things to the glory of Thy name. And we look forward to the day, Father, when we, as well as all Thy saints in the different tongues and tribes of the world, be gathered around the throne and with the Lamb to sing praises unto Thee with one voice in one accord as brothers and sisters in the Lord, without sin and in pure joy. For Jesus' sake we pray. Amen.